Hey, welcome back to my channel. It's Christine Grace and welcome back to In Conversation with Christine. Today I am joined by the lovely Deborah Powney. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
That's right, yeah.
Powney, yep. And Deborah is an expert on male victims of abuse and coercive control, so no doubt we're going to have a very interesting conversation today. I've got lots of questions to ask. So yeah, Deborah, I'm just going to sort of chuck it straight over to you and ask you to tell everyone who you are and what exactly it is that you do.
Well, I'm Deborah Powney, pronounced correctly, that's fantastic. I'm a lecturer in policing and criminology, but my background is in psychology, and I'm currently at the end of writing up my thesis on what is convolutedly called compensatory consequences in female and male victims of intimate partner violence. Wow. And in a nutshell, I'm looking at the experience of both female and male victims, but have a particular interest in male victims, but not just how victims go through their experience of partner abuse, but how they adapt to that.
Okay.
And obviously recover, hopefully.
Okay, so could you tell me again the name of your thesis that it is that you're working on?
It's called Compensatory Consequences in Female and Male Victims of Intimate Partner Violence. And I chose the label compensatory consequences because we often receive the narrative that victims of intimate partner violence, once experienced, are permanently broken. And I refute that. I think it's a possibility, but my view is that this constant messaging that we get put forward, particularly for female victims, that you are permanently vulnerable, even things like you can't walk out at night because there's these men out there that are parading the streets, all that kind of stuff. I'm actually writing it up as a nocebo effect, which is as you would imagine, the opposite of the placebo effect, where we expect good things to happen from nothing. Right. My view is that this constant messaging to women generally and female victims specifically does no good if we're constantly telling people that they can't recover, they will be experiencing all these negative psychological effects.
Yeah.
So I have a number of bugbears in this arena.
And is it specifically physical abuse that you look at?
No, I look at, I think the view of partner abuse that I suppose is more commonly referred to as domestic violence.
Yes.
That I think however you name that, certainly from my perspective, the abuse and violence encapsulates not just physical abuse, but psychological abuse, i.e. coercive control. So I think the definition is broadened to include all elements of domestic abuse.
Great. Okay. So obviously you're talking about compensatory consequences, and I find it really interesting that you talk about this narrative that people are sort of damaged goods once they've been abused. What might some compensatory consequences look like? Are we talking in terms of defense mechanisms, changes in behavior? Could you sort of expand a bit more on what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I'll probably start with why I've called it compensatory consequences. There's a shift. There's a particular area of psychology as a discipline that is labelled positive psychology. Okay. And from that, you'd probably think that it's quite fluffy and airy and everything's happy and jolly and stuff. And it is slightly, but what we try to do in positive psychology is round out the full experience. In no way are we denying that people have negative impact and negative effects, whether short term or longer. But what we try to do is balance that with the strengths that people can have, both as individually and as humanity. We've survived a lot of trauma and traumatic events as a species, but we can not only survive, but we can thrive. But as this is a relatively new focus, there's a number of names flying around. So there's adversarial growth, post-traumatic growth, positive adaptation, and compensatory consequences covers that. But what I wanted to do, what I was very mindful of, is that sometimes when you're a researcher, you can coin phrases that can find their way into the court system or the criminal justice system. And what I was acutely aware of was that I didn't want a solicitor stood in front of a victim, regardless of their gender, and say, you should be grateful that you've experienced this because you've received these positive adaptions, these things.
Of course, yeah.
So compensatory consequences means that you have been compensated as a consequence of you adapting to the experience you've been subjected to. So it wasn't just me, it was actually my supervisory team that came up with that. And I think it perfectly encapsulates what we're trying to put out there without thinking there's some kind of advantage of being put through this horrific experience. But again, these compensatory consequences can be greater belief in yourself, a kind of shake up of your worldview so that you understand the importance of things in life. So where you might have been a complete workaholic, you might get a compensatory consequence that says that's not really important in life. What's important is family and friends and experiences and everything else. And you might have seen it when someone's gone through a traumatic event such as disease, say someone's conquered cancer, and then they've decided to quit the day job, buy a boat, and sail single-handedly around the world. Now, that's an extreme example of what I'm looking at, but I truly believe in, to quote Nietzsche, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger.
Yeah.
And that's where I like to put my focus. I like to have a look at the whole experience, but rather than being stuck in that this is a terrible thing that's happened to you, I want to see how we can shift the experience for people that have been experienced partner abuse.
And so that people can move forward with it.
So that not only they can move forward, but they can take something from the fact that they've had to deal with this themselves, all their internal coping, all their adaptation. And often people have to fight through either the personal experience or a court experience or layers of.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they're not just surviving, they are thriving.
No, I'm definitely a fan of that same type of philosophy. You know, horrible things happen, but we don't have to let them destroy us. And I think that's quite a controversial take in this day and age, because the current consensus is more, if something happens to you, you are the worst person that's ever had to live. And, you know, no one's ever had it harder than you. It's like we can be compassionate and understanding, and we can always acknowledge someone's got it worse than us. But ultimately, wouldn't it be better if each of us can look at what we do go through and say, how can I see what's happened? And instead of looking at it this way, where it's all doom and gloom, maybe if I look at it this way, it might be a bit brighter. So, yeah, no doubt I'll be checking out your thesis, because I'm definitely going to need that to back up my arguments.
I was reading a paper the other day after coming across a podcast, and the paper was labelled "The Villainy of Victimhood," and it was talking about this notion that people are identifying with their victimhood.
Yes.
And it's become this sort of litany of this happened to me and this, and it's almost become a competition of who can have this whole list of victimization to be sort of the ladder's kind of turned on its head. So people are the more victim status you have, the higher up the virtue ladder you are.
Yes, and I almost feel as if people have become kind of masochists for their own self-destruction in a way. Like that's the only thing I can put it down to, is that there's been some kind of flip, and maybe it's because of what you say, maybe it's the ego driving on virtue, and if I've been through more, then it's also this notion that
you're an expert because you've experienced something, and yes, you are, but you're an expert of your experience.
Your experience, yeah.
You know, it's not something that can be generalized to the population.
No.
I got into this field because my first marriage was horrendously abusive, both physically and coercive.
Right.
And if I stuck to the narrative, it would all be about female victims and male perpetrators.
Yeah.
But I really didn't recognize myself in the narrative. I was a strong person. I came from a stable family, ordinary working class family, but very ordinary and stable. I was educated. I was successful at my work, and nothing really fitted. It didn't fit this victim broken person. And what that led to was me not only questioning, well, why aren't I in this literature? I thought, who else isn't in this literature? Which led me to male victims. So that was the kind of short route path into why aren't we looking at male victims here?
No, that makes sense, and I think it is quite surprising, because you could have very easily made it all about female victims and talking about your personal experience, but it's almost as if you've taken that as something to add to your knowledge to be able to apply to other people instead of just making it about you, which I think ultimately we should all do a bit more of in today's day and age. But
I think we experience things on with a number of variables, all multi-layered. Gender isn't the forefront of my existence. So I don't think I was abused by my partner because I was a woman. I think I was abused by my partner. Now, looking back on it, I wasn't in psychology at the time, but looking back on it for a number of reasons, I just happened to be a woman that he was in a relationship with. It's not because I was a woman.
No,
that's literally a small part of all the other variables that exist within that.
There was I'm probably going to get this completely wrong, and I can't think of his name for the life of me, but I believe he was a Russian novelist, and he wrote this book, and in the idea of the book, it was sort of looking at your circumstances and taking the responsibility for your circumstances upon your own shoulders. And I think in this book, he talks about how he ends up, I think it's called the Gulag Archipelago. I think that's the book. And he looks at him being in a gulag, which is like awful, right? And surely that's outside his circumstances. But he sort of says, I got myself here because I make the decisions for my life, and my decisions have led to me ending up here. And I think by the end of the book, he ultimately ends up getting himself out of it. Do you know the kind of thing that I'm talking about? And if so,
the issue is that when you talk about victims, particularly female victims, because that's the dominant narrative. Yeah. If you say something about you can't ask the question, why didn't you leave? And I understand that, but I would ask that the same question but from a different angle, which what made you stay? Because there's a number of reasons why people stay in a relationship. One of the top reasons is because I love them. You know, as fluffy as that sounds, a lot of times it's down to financial interdependence, children, moral responsibility. I stayed because I made vows and I was trying to stay true to those vows. So my moral compass almost became dysfunctional, even though it was from a good place.
What I wanted to ask was, you mentioned that, you know, you don't really fit into this statistic of the typical abuse victim because you came from, it sounds like you had a very similar upbringing to myself. You know, I'm working class family, you know, mum and dad together, married 30 years, like it's all very stable. What, in your own psychoanalysis of yourself, I guess, what do you think got you into that position in the first place? Because you would think, oh, maybe she had an abusive childhood, but if none of that was there, what would you say it was?
You can imagine this is when you're going through research, a lot of your work is about self-reflection, even self-reflection about how you've designed your study, why you've chosen that particular method, so on and so forth. But I literally went to counselling for to help me with my recovery.
Mm-hmm.
You have to practice what you preach,
Yep.
ultimately.
Yep.
So I went there and obviously did a lot of work on that. And I honestly, truly believe that what happened with me is I was conned by my ex-partner. He presented a picture that wasn't real. But ultimately, I believe people when they tell me certain things. So, like most of us do, if someone tells you something, you tend to think, why would they lie? You know, I wouldn't lie about that. Why would they lie? But ultimately, the abuse, the change didn't happen until we were married and we'd had our first child. And then it changed quite dramatically when my mother passed away. I was obviously vulnerable, getting a lot of attention, and it literally changed overnight. I think there was, if I look back and I'm really honest, there was various little red flags and things along the way, but it changed quite dramatically when my mum passed away.
And would you say that maybe he was, because no doubt, normal sane people don't go out and abuse, and you mentioned this, being conned and someone presenting themselves in a certain way and then it flipping. What is that on his part?
Well, now I can look back. I didn't understand it at the time, but obviously doing what I do, I would absolutely put him as narcissistic personality disorder.
Right, which the female equivalent would be borderline, correct?
Well, I'm not sure there's the female equivalent is something different. Okay. I think it's the same. It might manifest differently. But I don't think one is the other. I think they are they overlap, those two disorders, but I think they are different ultimately. Okay. But I think most people think narcissists are these fantastic, flamboyant, amazing people. Some are. I think narcissistic abusers with narcissistic personality disorder are actually quite vulnerable. Yes. Before I knew what it was, I would describe him as a vase. So you had this view of something that seemed quite beautiful, but there wasn't a great deal inside.
Right.
And in order to fill that vase, he had to crush, because I wasn't the first. And I actually wasn't the last in that relationship that got treated like that. But he didn't target weak people. He targeted quite strong, successful people, and then went about crushing them.
And was that to make himself feel better?
Yeah,
right,
absolutely. Because if you can crush someone who is seemingly successful and happy and all together and stuff, that gives you utmost power, doesn't it? That gives you a sense of power and control over them. But I think it was tied with vulnerability, because they obviously knew that he wasn't good enough, or felt that he wasn't good enough.
Yeah.
So didn't want to lose the partners, again, of which I was one.
Yeah.
So you had to crush them to keep them in place. Oh. So it's, as much as we think it's about control, I think it comes from a place of lack of control over themselves and a lack of belief in themselves for those particular type of abusers.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting because when you think about it, you would think that, if you're going to tear someone down, surely that would lead the abuser or the narcissistic person to think, oh, well, they're going to leave if I do that. So if they wanted you to stay, I guess it's kind of interesting, do they want you to leave or do they want you to stay? And it's that idea of someone who is abused will stay. And that's why I find it very interesting that you mentioned a lot of these victims of abuse will say the top reason is because of things like love.
Yeah, and that works for male and female victims. Male victims say the same as well, that they one of the top reasons is that they love their partner, so they don't want to leave them. It's not the similarities across victims are far greater than the differences across victims.
No, I can imagine, and I'm sure that that's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And I would like to sit here and say that people don't want to talk about that because they don't want to see men in this light of being vulnerable. But if I'm being completely honest, I don't think that's the case. I think it's that they don't want to see women in the light of being the abuser and being the narcissistic one. I'm not exactly sure how we got here as a society.
I can tell you.
I would love you to tell me, because how did we get into this position where women have just been given, essentially, I mean, to put it bluntly, a free pass to operate how men do?
Well, the answers are
how abusive men do, to clarify.
yeah. The answer lies in, and I've included this in the introduction to my thesis. I will not critique anything that I've not gone away and read myself.
Right.
So there's a massive schism in the field of domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, that's been raging since it kind of poked his head up in the 70s. And we have to credit the women's movement, feminism, for kind of bringing domestic abuse out into the public domain. Before that, it was something that happened behind closed doors. It was a private family matter, and it didn't get any attention. But the central premise of the feminist movement uses intimate partner violence as the kind of poster child for the demonstration that the patriarchy does as damage onto women. And often you'll hear the line, domestic abuse is perpetrated by men on women because they are women. And there's no explanation for that. It's just a really kind of top line, this is how it happens. And if you look through the sort of, I say, vintage feminist literature, in my thesis I label it foundational feminist literature. Those that have had the highest, the greatest influence of literally dismissed male victims and therefore female perpetrators. One of them says, feminist scholars, there's various types of feminism, approach this from these different angles. However, all of them agree that husband battering, and this is like, it used to be called wife battering back in the day. Husband battering is either non-existent or trivial. And then it was literally laid on that there's something called the Duluth model that talks about that it's has a center point that says domestic abuse is all about power and control. We've just had a conversation that says maybe it's not. Even the founder of that model says they didn't find any men wanted control over their partners, so it's innately flawed. But within that, all victims are categorized as she, all perpetrators are categorized as he. And they say, even if men do experience domestic abuse, even if it's with something as severe as a knife or a weapon, they don't really feel much fear. And if they do, it's temporary. So they literally just dismiss it. And it's over and over and over and over and over again. And you would think, okay, Debs, that was something that was written over 50 years ago. Times have changed. Society's changed. We've all become a bit more accepting. More women are out at work. We're all, sort of boss bitching it and all that kind of stuff. So attitudes have changed. But not only are those texts still used throughout all the feminist literature that has existed, it's also even highlighted and cited in our newly assented Domestic Abuse Act, in the Coercive Control Bill. All this stuff still appears there. Now, when you read the legislation, the actual, this is the law, it all looks gender neutral. But behind that, there's usually a statutory guidance that literally tells lawyers and judges and whoever else is involved, this is how you actually execute this law. It will absolutely start with domestic abuse is a gendered issue that happens by men to women because they are women. They are disproportionately affected by this, blah, blah, blah. Now, when this was all kicking off in the 70s, there were also feminist scholars that were researching both female and male victims. And they were absolutely feminist. When they were doing all the scholarship around female victims, they were really supported and heralded by the women's movement. As soon as they then said, oh, by the way, the evidence is showing that men are as likely to be victimized as women, not only were they excommunicated and thrown out of the gang, there were letter campaigns written against them if they were going for promotion. They had threats to themselves, physical threats to themselves and their family, and even bomb threats.
And who were these threats from?
The feminists, the women's movement. Now, within that literature that I spoke about, this vintage literature, one of the highly influential pieces says that if we find that this is true, that men are as likely to be victimized as women, this is not verbatim, by the way, then that will literally shake our foundations as a feminist movement.
Yeah.
So this is partner violence is an absolute foundational tenet of feminism. So if we then say, actually, this isn't gendered, this is something
it's a human
that
issue.
happens.
Yeah,
it's a human issue, a human behaviour issue.
Yes.
But that then puts a crack through the entire theory of oppression of women by men. Yeah. And it explodes it.
Because like you say, it's their poster.
Yeah. It's literally a pictorial representation of how they see the patriarchy. The woman with the bruise on her face, we still see it now when talking about domestic abuse. There'll be a woman cowering in the corner and you'll just see like a man's fist, and that's how it's categorized. And this is passing all the way through our modern day laws, policies, support or lack of support, because it's become protectionist in its manner. It wants to keep all the funding for themselves. And they even say, if we acknowledge that men are as likely to, then we're going to lose some of our funding.
Yeah. No,
so this,
and
don't think. So not for one instant is this about improving the situation. This is a racket.
Yes. Yeah. No, I completely agree with you, and I think that's the main issue at the end of the day. They don't want to lose in their eyes, and instead of helping everyone, they would rather not lose their initial cause ideology that they set out to achieve.
But don't forget, this isn't just in people's world belief, and there are people that truly believe that they are trying to do the best they can for women. Great, you crack on and do that. I have no issue with that. But I do have an issue when you start lobbying against another whole group of victims to uphold your ideology. But beyond this ideology, this is an industry where not only is people's belief system really entangled in this, but it also pays for their mortgage.
Yeah, that's it.
This affects people on an absolute day-to-day level. So they have to fight this cause, because it threatens not only their world belief, but also their livelihood. And
I think it's really interesting that you look at the male victims because they haven't been looked at for so long. You mentioned the women's empowerment movement, feminism and all of that, and how before it was mostly behind closed doors and the whole wife beaters thing, right?
Yeah.
Do you think it still happened just as much to men back then? Or do you think that... Because I wanted to know if perhaps there was a correlation with the feminist movement that maybe increased abuse towards men.
I haven't researched that, so I don't know the answer. But the research that happened around the same time that included male and female victims showed symmetry across there.
Because you don't hear that.
I think it's always been there, but I do think there's a gamma bias that says it doesn't really affect men in that way, because initially the focus was on physical violence. Now there's also research that shows that when people are thinking of physical violence, they tend to picture in their mind a big strong man and a little woman
Yes.
In a fist fight, right? And just as a caveat, research has shown that the most common form of domestic abuse is bi-directional.
Yes.
That people are essentially what could be seen as a toxic relationship.
Yeah.
You know. So, but outside of that, the research shows there's asymmetry. There's equality in the victim status, as it were.
Because that's definitely something you don't hear. The narrative has very much been, you know, up until the feminist movement, women were these frail little creatures, and men were essentially these abusers. Like you said, you know, the terminology is still present today. What I do want to ask you about is, you know, we can all picture what domestic abuse in terms of physical violence looks like for a man abusing a woman. And I feel like, unfortunately, when we imagine the reverse, there's a bit of a, like you said, it's trivial. People see the novelty of it, and how could someone small and frail be abusing a big man?
Okay.
What does that look like? What is there a pattern of how it generally looks when male victims?
There isn't a pattern to any abuser. There are patterns in various things, but for women, they offset this strength weight ratio advantage, I suppose, that men have by weaponizing and attacking their male partner when they are vulnerable, usually asleep or under the influence of drugs or alcohol.
Right.
So boiling kettles when men are asleep, having boiling water poured over them is not uncommon.
Wow.
Knitting needles. Guy had a knitting needle shoved in his ear whilst he was asleep. Knives. All those. If we're talking just physical violence,
yes,
that's the offset.
Right.
We might not be able to knock you out with a punch, but when you're asleep, if I pour a boiling kettle of water over you, that's going to give you third-degree burns.
Yeah.
You know, it's no amount of greater strength, height, or weight, or anything else. It makes your skin impervious to boiling water.
Especially not when you're asleep either.
No. Right. But then if we move beyond physical.
Yes, I wanted to ask about emotional abuse. I think the first thing I wanted to ask about emotional abuse is a conversation I come across a lot, and I hear of a lot, is what constitutes emotional abuse, because the legislation right now and what's going on in the court system, especially with regards to things like divorce, is often we hear of stories where the woman will just say, oh, well, he emotionally abused me. And unfortunately, the way that the court system is set up at the moment, in the family courts at least, I don't know about the criminal, but in the family courts at least, that's enough. And almost anything can constitute emotional abuse. So to you, in the field of psychology, what constitutes emotional abuse? Not gender specific, just as a human issue. What's emotional abuse?
Well, there's various sections of it, and the coercive control model that we have in our legislation today is actually it's often attributed to a guy called Evan Stark. He wrote a book that's very influential called Coercive Control: The Entrapment of Women.
Right.
And he's a feminist scholar. He makes no bones about that issue. But actually, the coercive control model that we have today is way before any feminist got hold of it, as it were. Right. It was actually based on research by a guy called Albert Biderman in 1957, and it was conducted on American prisoners of war in Japanese and Korean prisoner of war camps.
Okay.
And it all came out of the Nuremberg stuff. Do you remember in Nuremberg where they were saying, how come all these people who read it, you know, just evil, and that's why they were able to carry out these vile atrocities? And it came back that actually they're just ordinary people. Humans can actually do horrific things in their everyday.
We're all capable of evil if put in the right circumstances.
All capable of it, especially if you are fed a virtuous path of you think you're doing something right.
Yeah.
So this one of the reasons Albert Biderman undertook this research was to find out how trained military personnel in America, which does incredible military training, could actually be captured and broken in military combat. And what it transpired is that these are not incredibly complex and convoluted behaviors, but what they are systematic, persistent, and consistent to break you down. And it is things like isolating you so you become dependent on the captor. In this case, it would be the abusive partner. You are constantly put down and told you're worthless. And we've all, I don't know about you, but I will openly admit that when I've had arguments with my husband, you know, I've been known to call him a name or two, you dickhead or whatever.
Yeah.
But this is not about ordinary kind of couple conflict. This is about someone constantly telling you are worthless.
Right.
Every day. You're bad at your job. You've got no friends. Nobody likes you. It's like a script that's constantly fed to you.
Almost a chipping away.
Yeah, and it is exactly that. It's chipping away at your soul, your very being. So on top of that, there will also be, you know, embarrassing you in front of friends and family, even in your workplace, controlling you economically, threatening you with having your children taken away. And that happens to women as much as it does men, probably more so with men, actually, because we have this social norm.
Yeah.
But it's a whole category. It's not just one thing. You know, it's a whole category of things. So, for example,
I really want to know what happened with the, because I know that's a part of becoming the, I know that's a part of joining the SAS. You go through this, like torture method where they're not using anything physical and it's purely mental torture. So what kind of tactics are they using?
I'm not sure about the SAS. I would probably say though, well,
in the was it the 1957 study that you mentioned?
Oh, the ones where they've actually got them.
Yes.
What I'm talking about, this isolation, breaking them down.
Right.
Even things like sleep deprivation.
Right.
You know, not letting them actually get any health, not giving them good nutrition. For example, in my study, there was a guy, and I often talk about this, that had lost, I think it was about 30 pounds, or it was 20 kilos or something like that. I can't remember verbatim. And I went back through his data, and this is how subtle the control is. That his, you know, the banking app that you can have on your phone.
Yeah.
That you can set it up so it pings you every time something goes out of your account.
Yeah.
And I switched mine off because it was just terrifying, the amount of things were going.
Yeah.
I didn't want to know, you know, I'm okay. So, but his wife, he wasn't allowed cash by his wife.
Right.
So he was only allowed to buy things on his phone, right? And so anytime he bought something, it pinged her phone. She had the app on her phone. And he cited this example that he'd gone to Pret. He was at work. He'd gone to Pret and he'd got a sandwich and a coffee. So completely ordinary, nothing extravagant, a sandwich and a coffee. He'd go home at night and she would have this circular argument with him. Why were you in Pret? Why are you wasting our money? This is our money. Have this argument over and over again so that he couldn't get any sleep at night. And then he'd go into work and he wouldn't be able to perform at work. And then his boss would have a pop at him.
Yeah.
So it was just too much. So he stopped eating. And he actually said, I only ate what she told me I could eat when she told me I could eat it.
Wow.
So you just break people down so much that I've called it, I can't remember what I've called it in the report, but it's about compelled compliance.
Okay. So
it gets to the point where the person being abused is trying to avoid any kind of abuse, so they control their own behavior. The abuser doesn't even have to be there at that point, because they just think, I'm not going to go and buy myself a sandwich because it's not worth all the hassle when I get home.
So would that be a coping mechanism? Would that be their way of trying to cope with the abuse? Is that what you'd class a coping?
I think I would, if I had to put it in a category, I'd say it's avoidance. You've got a lot of things going on when you're in that situation. You've got a lot of.
So what's the difference between avoidance and a coping mechanism then?
Well, they're both.
Right.
They're both. They're also an outcome in PTSD. An outcome can be avoidance. You avoid things, and then it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that your life actually gets worse if you're avoiding certain elements. So it's one of those things that it's an outcome and a coping mechanism and a symptom. It's all very intertwined.
And what are some other examples of coping mechanisms and sort of resilience strategies that are observed among victims, both male and female, of abuse and coercive control?
There's, when you look at coping mechanisms, the kind of there's a lot of attention in psychology on coping, huge amount of literature. But the way I look at it, I take the model of there's kind of three types of coping. There's problem-focused coping, which in the literature tends to be more to do with men because they want to put actions in place to make sure something happens. So it's kind of an active coping thing. There's emotion coping that is sometimes, I think, been negatively portrayed as not as helpful.
Okay.
But for some victims it is really helpful, and it's usually associated with women. We like to talk more, we like to kind of work through things more, that kind of stuff. And then there's avoidance, which tends to be where all the sort of negative coping mechanisms, and I do the air quotes, and I'll tell you for why in a minute. So it'll be avoidance, smoking and substance abuse, denial, behavioral disengagement, and essentially they're all subsections of avoidance behavior, trying to avoid actually dealing with what's going on there. Now, in the long term, that can have a negative effect on anyone, whatever it is you're avoiding, whatever the trauma is, be it bereavement, disease, natural disaster, all that kind of stuff. But in the immediate after effect of some kind of trauma, avoidance might give your mind that breathing space to kind of absorb the impact of that. So as much as things can be labelled good, bad, problem, emotional, all that stuff, that they do tend to cloud each other. Right. But in the main, what I'm finding from my research is men tend to use more problem solving or active coping mechanisms, although there is a little bit of emotion in there, particularly around friends and family, using less formal support mechanisms. But what, again, in my research, what I found is behavioral disengagement, literally kind of separating yourself from that, is the strongest negative coping mechanism. Substance abuse wasn't so prevalent in there, but it is used for both female and male victims as a coping mechanism.
But it's more dissociation rather than having to take drugs to dissociate. It happens.
It's more of that sort of like, I'm not dealing with this because I can't
out.
Look at this. Yeah.
Okay. And how do you think that societal attitudes towards gender can play a role in this issue? Is there anything you've come across in your research?
Vast. It's absolutely vast. I don't think, like we said previously, this is a human issue. This isn't a gender issue.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but gender does not rule my life. I don't wake up in the morning and think, I am woman, hear me roar. I tend to think, God, I need a coffee. It's most of us don't function on this. Like, gender is everything. Gender
a very
is everything.
Small, loud group of people at the moment do operate on that front, but no, most normal, sane people know.
and most people have just normal interactions with people.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know about you, but I know great people across the genders, and I know arseholes across the genders. It's a behavioural issue, not a gender issue.
No.
But the impact of gender is felt absolutely keenly with the fact that we have this dominant narrative that says this is something that happens to women by men. because not only my view on this whole narrative doesn't even help the women it professes to help.
And for the reason,
well, because for me there are 5 groups in this that this narrative fails on every single level.
Right.
The first one is male victims, clearly, because they are not recognised, they are not accounted for, and they receive very, very little funding or resources or anything else. And it directly contributes to the male suicide rates that are coming here. And it has a knock-on effect that is almost webbed out into our psyche. So this absolute crap of toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
The things that are going on in schools, talking about violence against women and girls, and going into schools and essentially telling boys that they are
dangerous,
bad of original sin, just because they were born male. I absolutely rail against that.
It's so harmful, it really is. But I don't think people are going to realise the long-term effects that's going to have on boys, being told that.
And girls. And
girls, of course, because then the girls have this ultimate perception, and it just creates a divide between the genders from the get-go.
Well, this leads me on to female victims. So we've done male victims. Let's take a look at female victims. And we spoke previously about this nocebo effect, this constant view that women can't go out of their house because there's some predatory man, and this absolute insidious thing that we know it's not all men, but how do we know who is who? You know, it's, you know, even if you actually look at the statistics, you are 4 times, even at the lowest rates, you are 4 times likely to be murdered on the streets if you are a man than if you are a woman. Wow. But no one actually talks about that. We're always talking about how dangerous it is for a woman to go out. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but I tell my daughter, if she's out on the street, be careful, don't walk down a dark alley. But I also tell my son the same thing, exact same thing.
Yeah.
Because bad people are out there.
Yeah.
The majority of people are good people, just ordinary good people trying to crack on with their lives.
Yeah.
So I don't care what gender you are, be careful. You know, just don't walk down a dark alley, stay where the lights are. If you're in trouble, call me, I'll come and get you.
Yeah.
Okay, it's that ordinary stuff. So with female victims, we're putting them in a state of fear unnecessarily by telling them that there's this toxic masculinity and all men are out there, they can't walk on the streets, you're permanently broken as a victim. You know, there's no light at the end of this dark tunnel that's been painted for them. For male perpetrators, the organisation that accredits perpetrator programs is Respect, which is one of the big 3 organisations that's Respect, Refuge and Women's Aid, that talk about how this is a gendered paradigm and how it's because men are in the patriarchy. So all the behavioural programmes that are there to change behaviour in male perpetrators is ineffective, because it's essentially saying you're bad because you're man.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing in there that helps them to cope with addictions, learnt behaviour, personality disorders, or trauma responses, all the different things that we look at in psychology for what might make someone violent and antisocial. For female perpetrators, there are no perpetrator programs.
There's no help. Yeah.
Because they don't exist. So you're condemning female perpetrators to a life of violence because the literature shows that if a woman instigates violence, she's more likely to be physically harmed because of the strength-weight ratio. She's going at a bloke all the time and he shoves her, or even hits her, you know, quite severe. She's going to be hurt.
Yeah.
On average, she's going to be smaller than him. So we're condemning women that use abuse to a life of violence and a life of risk.
And we can't be ignorant to the perpetrators in all of this because of what we said earlier. Every single one of us is capable of evil if put in the right circumstances. And I think 100%. That's what I hear a lot with this, you know, the conversation surrounding domestic violence, coercive control, on either sides of the coin. We focus on the victims, and that's very important. And I'm not saying that we should focus on one side more than the other, but we need to realise it's a two-sided deal. And actually, something needs to be done with regards to the perpetrators just as much as the victims to prevent more perpetrators. Yes.
But ultimately, that full group, right in the centre of that, the children. Children are significant in this, not just as victims that are witnessing this and absorbing this and living in a life of eggshells and terror. But if you don't tackle those four groups, female victims, male victims, female perpetrators and male perpetrators, you are never going to resolve this issue, and you are going to leave children vulnerable. And that in and of itself is a bias from this narrative that, in my view, and that of research that sees this as a family violence issue, it lets everybody down.
And in your view, with regards to children, I'm not sure if you've had a look at the literature, but do you happen to know children who come from these types of homes, are they more likely to then become victims of domestic abuse themselves? Obviously, I know that's the answer to that is probably yes, but I want to know, are they just as likely to also become perpetrators?
Yes and yes.
Right.
There's a lot of yeses and a lot of no's on this. So just because you've witnessed it or been subjected to it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go on and be a perpetrator or a victim. But the way I example this when I'm discussing my research is, do you remember when you were little and you'd never actually stayed away overnight at a friend's house, and you had your routine, and your routine was as it was, and not that you gave it much thought, but if someone had said to you, do you think everyone does this the same way, you'd have said yes.
Yeah.
And then you go into someone else's house and they don't have tea at the same time as you do, and they don't have a drink with their dinner like you do, and their house smells different, and you know, it's all, and all of a sudden
I found it crazy that my friends weren't allowed to drink fizzy drinks. I was like, oh my God, your parents are these cruel people who don't let you
have to drink water. Yeah. So yeah, there's all these differences. But if you've grown up in a household that is essentially mutually combative, or there's an example of violence within there, how do you know there's a different way of handling life?
Yes.
Until you go into somewhere else, or until someone says to you, actually, you don't need to deal with ordinary relational conflict in that manner. Yes, you might, have a bit of an argument and call someone a dickhead, but that's it. You can regulate yourself and understand that you're human, people fall out, it's not the end of the world. They're not going to leave you or abandon you or whatever. So it's a very complex picture. Now, what tends to be painted by the gendered narrative is that children that witness that, all females will go on to be victims, and all perpetrators are at risk at being males are at risk at being perpetrators. It's not true. It's not true. Some perpetrators have never been involved in any type of abuse in a family setting. Others have. It's what we're forgetting here is that there's an individual within here with personality traits and everything else. And also it depends on if you've got a supportive third party, if your parents got themselves sorted out, or if they separated and life moved on. And, there's a lot of variables in this. But it isn't as clean cut as girls go on to be victims and males go on to be perpetrators.
And just staying with the children for a second, life does happen sometimes, and especially in the sort of space that I'm in, for the argument for things like divorce and people separating, the go-to is always domestic violence. And I think it is important to notice that domestic violence, in the case of divorce at least, it isn't the main reason for it. But it does happen. And which is the reason I'm highlighting the fact that it's unusual is because it's not often I'm in a conversation that we are talking about the extremes. So in these extreme circumstances, when life does happen and someone has been abused or both people are abusing each other, how do you move forward with that? Obviously, I know in your specific case it was separation, but how do families move forward through these things, if it is separation, if it is something like counselling or therapy to get through it, and ultimately, what's the best way for the children in these scenarios?
Yeah, again, I wouldn't say there's a best way. I can talk from personal experience of what happened with me. I realised that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. And I literally made a decision that I was going to talk to people and ask them for help. And I remember a couple of days after finally separating that I went to my daughter's nursery and said to them, this is what's happening, this is what I'm trying to do. I went into my place of work, and I was relatively new.
And you said that you were physically abused as well.
Physically and controlled. I didn't understand the control at the time. I remember sitting going on the floor in my bathroom thinking I was going insane because I couldn't figure out what was going on all the time. Now I can go back and literally label everything like, oh right, that was that and this was that. Oh right, okay, right. Yeah. And it's strange because that, for me, that gives me an objective perspective that I can actually
out of it. Yeah.
Yes. And understand it and then put it back together, if you know what I mean.
I really
now
do,
some people might not be as analytic as I am. Some people are, but I made a conscious decision to reach out for help anywhere I could have it. I also made a decision because
I just want to touch on that quickly, because we often in the sort of red pill space that they call it, I wouldn't necessarily class myself as within that field, but it's there's definitely a lot of points within it that I do agree with, and I see as logical explanations. We often talk about outsourcing family problems. So I guess the thing that's just popped to mind for me when you say you decided to go out and ask for help, some might argue, I personally don't, but some might argue you're outsourcing a family problem, and why couldn't you have just spoke to him? What would be there was I think if you, the mistake that some people make is that you think you're having a conversation with a rational person. Right.
Now, this is someone that was not rational.
No.
Me saying, and this is not something that this was the first time this happened and I was like out.
No.
This was something that was persistent and consistent over a number of years.
Right.
And persisted post-separation. I actually was taken through court longer than I was married to this person. And halfway through, 3 years into my court case, went litigant in person because I ran out of money. I couldn't afford to. I almost had what is depicted as the typical male kind of example of it. I didn't have legal aid because I was working. He got legal aid. He just got in before it all ended, so it didn't cost him anything to take me to court. So I went to court a lot. But what I was outsourcing was, I'm not going to be able to pick my child up at this time because it's just me. It wasn't me saying my husband is this and this, that and the other. It was, I'm currently going through a separation. I'm going to need a bit of support.
And did you mention the physical abuse to people when you were asking for help? No, not at all. Not for a long time. And if I'm absolutely honest, that was rare but severe. So it wasn't so much that this was ongoing physical violence. It was the threat of when it was going to be bad.
Absolutely. So, but it was absolutely that drip feeding day to day. You're a bad mum. You're crap at your job. No one likes you. You've got no friends. This, that, and the other. And it was literally like a script that I would just think, and in my head, I don't know if this was just my coping mechanisms at the time. I'd think, well, you've done wife, you've done friend. Oh no, here's mother. You remembered mother.
Yeah, you almost kind of knew what was coming.
Yeah, just a tick box. You're just going through it. it was a whole litany of everything that you could tick off. Economically abused.
And there was no room for negotiation with him?
No.
Wow.
None whatsoever. I would literally put myself at the extreme end of coercive control.
Yeah.
And it's quite strange when you're going through it and you're designing studies for this and you think, oh yeah, I've got all of that.
I remember being there. Yeah.
Yes. Which is also how I fail to understand how any victim can deny another victim's experience. I don't care about your gender. Some of the data I read, I'm fortunate to live where I live. I've literally have to think, right, I've got to go for a walk because this is horrific. You know, this is what these men have gone through is horrific. And I remember how I felt at the time. I don't understand how someone that had been through that could deny another person solely based on their gender.
No, I completely agree with you. It ultimately it doesn't make any sense to deny someone else's experience, especially if you've gone through it yourself. But just to quickly revert back to the children. So in these situations, you were mentioning that, you know, you decided to separate. How old roughly were your children when all of this happened, if you don't mind?
My youngest was almost 3 and my eldest was 5. Okay. And what brought it to an absolute conclusion was when I could see how much it was affecting them. Right. Because it's really easy to at the time, it was easy for me to take the brunt of it because I still couldn't figure out that this was abusive. I thought it was just a horrible relationship, and
because your moral compass wanted to make it work.
Yeah, it was all that, you know, in sickness and in health. All right, well, this is the sickness bit. You don't just bail on a marriage and stuff. And sometimes a good moral compass can become maladaptive if it's harming you. But it got to the point where I could see it was affecting them. And you can do a lot of things to me, but as soon as it affects the children, that's it. I also made a conscious decision to be honest with my children at an age-appropriate level.
So what did that look like?
Well, I can give you a perfect example of this. My ex-partner drank a lot, and my eldest, they were still so little that we were bathing together, and it was something. I was working full time and they were at school and after school club and stuff. But I needed them to be grounded because I needed to make sure that all the stuff that they'd been through, we were having a bath together, we would have dinner together, story time. That routine was absolutely imperative for all of us. I think we all needed a bit of.
It's almost as if you're on a bridge and you've got, you know, it's a really rocky sort of bridge, and there's all this chaos going down below you, and it's an old bridge, and you're trying not to fall, and it's like you're just making sure they've got that rope.
Yeah, just those little rails in place.
Yeah. No, that's the image I get from you saying that.
Totally. It was just that, right? We need some safety in this, and he asked me. He actually used the word, "Is Daddy an alcoholic?" And
how old is he?
I sat there and said, do you know what that word means? Because that's not a word that you would associate with a 5-year-old.
Wow.
And he said, he likes beer too much. And I thought that was a really age-appropriate way to understand what alcoholism is. And I said, yes. And then he just picked up his toys and carried on. He didn't want any further explanation. And I thought, do I lie? Do I lie and say, no? And
because then you teach him that behaviour is, oh no, that's not an alcoholic.
But what you have to remember is we'd been gaslit for a number of years by that point. You know, our reality didn't mean anything. And what I made the conscious decision to be honest, because they needed that truth. They needed that truth more than I did, because I'm the only stable person in their life now. If I'm going to lie to them, where are they ever going to find truth?
Yeah.
So it was absolutely age appropriate, and it was absolutely led by them, but I told them the truth.
And when you separated, I tend to pry a bit, so please do tell me if I'm digging too deep. It's just
can I just say it wasn't a separation. He was removed from the property by the police.
Right. Okay. So when that happened, and the situation was ultimately brought to a halt by the police.
Yes.
Again, I'm very focused on the children in this particular scenario, because we have to acknowledge that these things happen, and when there are children involved, these children need a way to move forward in life, because that's not normal, and you didn't go through it in your childhood, I didn't go through it, so you wouldn't want other kids to have to go through it. So how did you continue to be honest and stable after that? Did you tell them the severity of what happened? What does that kind of look like?
No, I think I was absolutely led by them. So if they asked a question, I would answer it. It wasn't I have an issue with you don't need to tell children, you don't need to tell them everything.
No.
And what's going on for you doesn't need to be projected onto your kids. And I'm sure most parents that have been through this feel exactly the same. In fact, most parents I speak to are like, I'm really I'll take as much as I can. I'll take the flak as long as they're okay.
Yeah.
But I suppose you have to leave the door open.
Yes.
For questions as they grow up. I mean, my eldest is now 17 and my youngest is getting on for 15. I mean, it's a while ago. And I had a conversation not too long ago with my eldest who said, I'm worried I'm going to be like him. And I literally went out for a walk with him and said, you are absolutely nothing like him. And if he still has good bits. As much as he did that to me, my children are also 50% his genetics. He doesn't see them anymore. He hasn't for a while. That was court ordered.
Right.
And then strangely enough, after he lost his funding through legal aid, he didn't see them after that. So I'm also acutely aware that I'm remarried, by the way.
Well, congratulations.
I got to start to say, strangely enough, you'd think again, you would think that maybe you would not do that, but it was that person. It wasn't all of mankind.
No.
So you have to be prepared for that question to come up again, and their fears and their issues. Again, I would never be in a room with that person ever again. But when the children got phones, I put their father's phone number in there and said, if you want to contact him, there you do.
Yeah.
My youngest did. Didn't go too well, but did. My eldest doesn't want to. But then we were in the car. Yeah, they have the option. I didn't ever want to be accused of keeping them away from him. They can make up their own mind. And again, in the car the other day, my eldest said, I think I might go and see him one day. And I said, absolutely, that's your choice. It's you want to go and see him? That's
the circumstances of your life are not the circumstances of their life, and I really
I don't want to dump my trauma onto them. They I'm of the belief that I have children, but I don't own my children.
Yes.
Especially
and you mentioned about other parents. You said how they tend to, people who've been through this, they tend to want to take the load onto themselves. A question I have to ask, to play the devil's advocate, I guess, in this scenario, as awful as that sounds in these type of scenarios, but do you then, I would worry, putting myself in this scenario, I would worry then that, are you then presenting a pattern of behaviour that they could perhaps learn? And then when they go on to have intimate relationships later in life, are they going to do the same thing? Are they going to, let everything pile on themselves because they don't want to burden other people?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Don't get me wrong. There's been times when I've kind of lost it and started shouting about the mess in the house and that kind of stuff. And then,
you're a mum, that doesn't surprise me.
And then literally gone to my kids and said, this is not anything you've done, actually. I'm just stressed out about things. I've got a lot going on. And as much as we try and protect children from things, they see, they hear, they know, they feel your mood, all the rest of it. So again, you don't need, parents that have been abused feel guilty because they feel like they've put their children in that situation.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's the old adage of you need to kind of forgive yourself. Forgive yourself that you went into that situation with the best intentions. And like I said to you at the beginning, I feel like I got conned. I got conned into something. A picture was painted that wasn't reality. And by the time I figured out reality, it was a bit too late.
Yeah.
But which is also, strangely enough, going back to the very beginning with compensatory consequences. I've spoke to a number of people that have been through this and have, again, not just surviving, but are thriving. And what's really interesting is a number of them tell me, oh, I've got a bullshit detector like you wouldn't believe now. And it's almost, you know, I've
compensatory consequence.
It's a compensatory consequence that not only can they detect this kind of behavior, but they are taking none of it. They see it and they're like, whoa, not in this. So it's something that they've not only adapted to, but they've
conquered it.
They've conquered it, but they've mastered it. You know, they'll. I've got a friend who says I can smell a narc from 3 miles away. You know, and I've had men that says no, I can spot that immediately. You know, so it's almost like that. You get a tool that says, oh, we're not going to go near that. We can see the red flags, and not only can we see them, but we respond to them. Because again, you talk to victims and they say, oh, if I look back on it, there was a red flag here and a red flag there, and I just thought, oh, maybe they've had a bad day, or maybe they've had a tough upbringing. And I know that because that's exactly what I said. You know, it's like, oh, they're from a broken family, maybe they just didn't get the same amount of love as me, and we make excuses for behavior. And the one thing I preach about is boundaries. Make sure you're comfortable with your boundaries and stick to them. Absolutely stick to them. If you say to someone, I don't like the way you do that, make sure you stick to it, because ultimately, without those boundaries, that's what got me and several other people that I've spoken to into that situation where we just kind of give a bit and we give a bit and we give a bit and we keep giving until we've got nothing left.
Yeah, and then you're ultimately in the most vulnerable position that you could be. Now, I'm really a fan of this term that you have coined, compensatory consequences, because, you know, again, it's this mindset of life is shit. My dad always says to me, life's shit and then you die. Right? Which
it's brutal. Life. But this is part of the problem where we are now, that life is brutal. But again, we've painted this image that you have the right to be consistently happy and consistently content. And this goes back again to what we were saying about the villainy of victimhood. Yes. As soon as that dips a bit, people wear it as a badge of honor. Instead of just thinking, well, that's life. And, you know, you go through life and you learn and you mature and you know, as you're supposed to, you know, all that kind of stuff. But people are taking any kind of blip as an offence.
Well, it's because they can, isn't it? It's like if we look at
everything this day,
all the Maslow's hierarchy of needs are essentially met. So people have nothing else to do. They're not worried about where the next meal's coming from. They've got roofs over their heads. They've got water. You know, we're all got Amazon deliveries at our doorstep, Chinese down the road. Like, everything's sorted. So, so
even me in the middle of nowhere.
So people, they, you know, I guess, as harsh as it might sound, some people are just bored and all they can do is focus on what can I do to virtue signal today. I know what I'll do. I'll be a victim. But yeah, on the high note of, you know, the positives of all of this, which is compensatory consequences, I wanted to end with asking you to give, if you can, obviously I understand there's confidentiality things that are involved here, but if you can, a success story that you've heard. And I want you to give me a success story of a male victim of domestic abuse, considering we've all heard many stories on the other side.
Well, my research takes us on a path from particularly with male victims, but took us on a path from the types of coercive behaviour that male victims experience, the negative impact, including depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, and PTSD, the coping mechanisms that put in place, and then post-traumatic growth.
Right.
I also did a meta-analysis on compensatory consequences for female victims. And in order to give it a comparison, I looked at post-traumatic growth effect in all types of trauma, because very little, none in men, but very little even on female victims, research had focused on recovery and growth. Because again, this narrative is very much negative focus. We need more money because it's all really bad for women. We need more money because the effects are horrendously bad. So I had a look at post-traumatic growth across various other traumas: natural disaster, combat, disease, HIV, you name it. It's all been Holocaust survivors. There's been a whole load of research on other traumas, but intimate partner violence has been kind of protected from this positive
Well, because
effect.
if they solve the problem, then they can't get any more money for the funding, can they?
Exactly. But for me, this is not about the money or anything. This is about how we help victims move forward and recover. And what I found is the effect size in female victims of partner abuse was higher than all those other traumas that I've shown you. And there's a notion that the more extreme the trauma, the more the potential for growth.
Wow.
Because if you've essentially, to put it into simple terms, hit rock bottom, to coin a lyric from a song, the only way is up. So you've got more potential. If you've got nothing, if you're completely there, your whole worldview is shattered and you've got to rebuild that again. You know, the potential for growth is vast. And then when I looked at male victims, because there was none of that research on male victims that I'd conducted on female, I did that pass with that. This is what you've experienced. This is the negative effect. These are the coping mechanisms. And this is the compensatory consequences in post-traumatic growth. It was exactly the same, that they experienced more growth than all these other traumas that were put in place. Wow. So as much as the effects from partner abuse can be absolutely devastating, there is also huge potential for not just surviving, but thriving. And so that's the message I want my thesis to put across. There's a couple. One is that this narrative helps nobody. This absolute singular, it's from men to women because they are women, helps no one. But also there is a rather lovely, bright, glittery light at the end of that horrible dark tunnel.
No, amazing. Thank you so much, Deborah. There we have it. Deborah Powney in conversation with Christine. It was been an absolute pleasure, and I've definitely learned a lot. I've definitely learnt a lot. No doubt I'm going to be digging in. I've made a whole bunch of notes after everything you've said, and no doubt I'm going to be digging into all of this because you have piqued my interest. I'm a big fan of the field of psychology, so it's always really good to speak to an expert to get into the nitty-gritty details about certain things. So yeah, thank you so much. No doubt I'm sure we'll be inviting you to come and join a panel at some point. We often talk about men's issues.
Lovely. I would love to.
And I think you'd be a really great person for us to have on. So yeah, can you tell the people where they can find you or where they can find some of your work?
Yeah, I've got a budding YouTube channel. It's got a video on about male victims. It's called the Voice of Men. It's actual statements that they've given us, and voiceover actors have put that on there, and that's open to any practitioner or anyone that wants to educate people about male victims. But you can also find me on Twitter. I'm on there. My academic account is Deborah Powney, and you'll find me on there most days.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you so much. Yeah, guys, if you like the video, please do give it a huge thumbs up and leave your thoughts below on this conversation in the comments section. Make sure you subscribe to keep up to date with all of our episodes of In Conversation with Christine, and I will see you very soon in the next one.